The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as tourists gathered behind the red rope barriers. Among them stood Marcus Thompson, a 42-year-old man whose left leg bore the invisible weight of his service in Afghanistan. The prosthetic limb, hidden beneath his dark jeans, was a constant reminder of the roadside bomb that had changed his life forever 3 years ago. Marcus had traveled from his small flat in Manchester to London for this moment. His 8-year-old daughter Emma had begged him to visit the palace and see the famous guards. It was her birthday wish, and despite his tight budget, he couldn't deny her this simple joy. Emma bounced excitedly beside him, her blonde pigtails dancing as she pointed at the tall, stoic guards in their red uniforms and black bearskin hats. "Daddy, they look like toy soldiers," Emma whispered, tugging at Marcus's jacket sleeve. Her blue eyes sparkled with wonder as she pressed against the barrier, trying to get a better view. Marcus smiled down at his daughter, his heart warming at her innocent excitement. These moments of pure happiness had become precious to him since the divorce. His ex-wife, Sarah, had struggled to cope with his injuries and the nightmares that followed his return home. The marriage hadn't survived the strain, leaving Marcus to rebuild his life piece by piece. "They're called the Queen's Guard, sweetheart," Marcus explained softly, placing his hand on Emma's shoulder. "They protect the royal family and never move from their posts, no matter what happens around them." The crowd around them grew larger as the morning progressed. Families with children, elderly couples with cameras, and tour groups speaking various languages all jostled for the best viewing positions. The atmosphere was festive and respectful, with most visitors maintaining the proper distance and speaking in hushed tones out of reverence for the historic location. Marcus noticed how Emma's face lit up every time one of the guards shifted slightly, or when the sunlight caught the golden buttons on their uniforms. He pulled out his phone to capture her expression, wanting to preserve this moment of pure joy. The camera clicked softly as Emma waved enthusiastically at the nearest guard, hoping for some acknowledgement that would never come. Behind them, a commotion began to build. A loud voice cut through the gentle murmur of the crowd, drawing annoyed glances from nearby tourists. Marcus turned to see a man in an expensive suit pushing through the gathered people, his face red with apparent frustration. The man appeared to be in his late 30s, with perfectly styled hair and designer sunglasses perched on his head. His leather shoes clicked aggressively against the stones as he shoved past families and elderly visitors without apology. Several people stumbled as he forced his way forward, muttering complaints under their breath. "Excuse me, coming through," the man announced loudly, though his tone suggested he wasn't asking permission. "Some of us have important places to be." Marcus instinctively pulled Emma closer as the disruptive visitor approached their section of the barrier. The man's behavior was creating an uncomfortable tension in what had been a peaceful morning gathering. Children started to look anxious as their parents shifted protectively around them. The well-dressed stranger finally reached the front barrier, positioning himself directly next to Marcus and Emma. He immediately began taking selfies with his expensive phone, extending his arm over the rope to get better angles. His loud commentary about the guards and the palace showed a complete lack of respect for the solemn nature of the ceremony. "These guys just stand there all day," he said loudly to no one in particular. "What a waste of taxpayer money. I could hire better security for my company." Emma looked up at her father with confused eyes, not understanding why someone would speak so rudely about the impressive soldiers. Marcus gently squeezed her hand, silently encouraging her to ignore the unpleasant man beside them. The stranger noticed Emma's fascination with the guards and seemed to take pleasure in disrupting her wonder. "Little girl, you know these aren't real soldiers, right? They're just for show, like actors in a play. Real soldiers actually do something useful." Marcus felt his jaw tighten at the comment, but he chose to remain silent. He had learned to pick his battles carefully since returning from deployment. The last thing he wanted was to create a scene in front of his daughter, or disrespect this historic place with an argument. However, the man's behavior continued to escalate. He began making jokes about the guards' uniforms, their hats, and their dedication to standing motionless. Other tourists started to move away from his immediate area, clearly uncomfortable with his disruptive presence. Emma tugged on Marcus's jacket again, her earlier excitement now mixed with confusion and concern. "Daddy, why is that man being mean about the soldiers?" Marcus knelt down to Emma's level, speaking quietly so only she could hear. "Sometimes people don't understand how important certain jobs are, sweetheart. These guards work very hard to keep everyone safe, just like soldiers do in other places." The explanation seemed to satisfy Emma, and her smile returned as she focused on watching the guards. Marcus stood back up, hoping the unpleasant man would lose interest and move on to bother someone else. Unfortunately, the stranger seemed to be just getting started with his disruptive behavior. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting shorter shadows across the courtyard, Marcus had no idea that this peaceful outing with his daughter was about to take a dramatic turn. The man beside them was about to reveal just how cruel and thoughtless a person could be, setting in motion a series of events that would shock everyone present and deliver a lesson in respect that no one would ever forget. The man in the expensive suit continued his obnoxious behavior, growing bolder with each passing minute. He had introduced himself loudly to nearby tourists as Derek Ashworth, claiming to be a successful businessman from London's financial district. His gold watch caught the sunlight as he gestured wildly while speaking, and his voice carried across the courtyard despite the disapproving looks from other visitors. Derek seemed to feed off the attention, even if it was negative. He began making increasingly inappropriate comments about the guards, suggesting they were wasting their lives standing around playing dress-up instead of getting real jobs. His behavior was drawing the attention of palace security, though they maintained their professional distance while keeping a watchful eye on the situation. Emma had grown quiet beside her father, no longer bouncing with excitement. The man's harsh words and aggressive energy were dampening her birthday celebration. Marcus noticed his daughter's change in mood and felt his protective instincts stirring. He had hoped Derek would simply tire of his performance and leave, but the opposite seemed to be happening. "You know what's really pathetic?" Derek announced to the crowd around him. "These guys probably couldn't handle real combat. They're just fancy doormen with silly hats." Several tourists shifted uncomfortably at his words. An elderly man wearing a veteran's cap shook his head in disgust and whispered something to his wife. A family with young children quietly moved to a different section of the viewing area, clearly not wanting their kids to hear such disrespectful comments. Marcus felt his hands clench involuntarily. Derek's ignorant remarks about soldiers and combat struck deep, touching wounds that were still healing from his own military service. But he reminded himself that he was here for Emma, not to engage with someone who clearly had no understanding of sacrifice or service. Derek pulled out his phone again and began recording a video narrating his own tour of the palace with deliberately provocative commentary. "Here I am at Buckingham Palace, watching the world's most overpaid security guards," he said into the camera. "I bet my company's security team could do this job better, and they wouldn't need the fancy costumes." The bossy, nearest guard remained perfectly still, staring straight ahead despite Derek's attempts to provoke a reaction. The professional discipline of the Queen's Guard was legendary, and Derek's childish behavior was having no effect on the soldiers' composure. Frustrated by his inability to get a response from the guards, Derek began to look around for another target for his attention-seeking behavior. His eyes swept across the crowd of tourists, seeming to search for someone he could antagonize or embarrass for his video. That's when his gaze fell on Marcus. Derek noticed the slight favor Marcus showed to his left leg when shifting his weight. It was subtle, barely noticeable to most people, but Derek's cruel instincts picked up on what he perceived as a weakness. A predatory smile spread across his face as he studied Marcus more carefully. "Excuse me," Derek said loudly, pointing his phone toward Marcus. You look like you might have some military experience. What do you think about these toy soldiers? Here." Marcus looked up from Emma, realizing he was being directly addressed. He could feel the eyes of nearby tourists turning toward him, and his daughter squeezed his hand tighter. "I think they're doing their job professionally," Marcus replied quietly, hoping to avoid further engagement. Derek wasn't satisfied with the diplomatic response. He moved closer, his phone still recording, clearly sensing an opportunity to create more dramatic content for his video. "Come on, you can be honest. As someone who's probably seen real action, don't you think this whole ceremony is just a tourist attraction? A waste of resources?" The crowd around them had grown silent, sensing the tension building between the two men. Emma looked up at her father with worried eyes, not understanding why the mean man was now targeting them specifically. Marcus took a deep breath, fighting to maintain his composure. "I think every person who serves their country deserves respect, regardless of their assignment," he said firmly, but without raising his voice. Derek laughed mockingly. "Oh, we've got a patriot here. Let me guess, you did a tour somewhere safe. Maybe pushing papers in an office, and now you think you're a war hero?" The cruel assumption hung in the air like poison. Several tourists gasped at Derek's blatant rudeness, and even some who had been ignoring the situation turned to stare in shock. The elderly veteran with the cap stepped forward slightly, his face flushed with anger at the insult to a fellow serviceman. Marcus felt Emma's small hand tremble in his own. His daughter was witnessing this unprovoked attack, and he could see the confusion and fear in her young eyes. The protective father in him warred with the disciplined soldier, both sides demanding action but for different reasons. "I served where my country needed me," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions building inside him. "Just like these guards are serving where they're needed now." Derek sensed he had struck a nerve and pressed his advantage. "Right. I'm sure you saw plenty of action filing reports or fixing computers. That's probably why you feel such kinship with these ceremonial soldiers who've never seen a real fight in their lives." The insult was designed to wound, and Derek's satisfied expression showed he believed he had successfully diminished Marcus in front of the crowd and his camera. He had no idea that he was about to cross a line that would expose his own character in the most humiliating way possible, setting the stage for a confrontation that would teach him the true meaning of courage and sacrifice. Derek's confidence grew with each insulting comment, mistaking Marcus's restraint for weakness. The businessman was clearly enjoying what he perceived as his dominance over the situation, and his phone continued recording what he likely thought would be entertaining content for his social media followers. "Look at this guy," Derek said into his camera, gesturing toward Marcus with obvious disdain. "Probably spent his whole military career in some safe base, and now he's out here with his kid pretending to be a tough veteran. These are the kinds of people who demand respect they never earned." Emma began to cry softly, overwhelmed by the mean man's harsh words directed at her beloved father. She didn't understand all the military terms or the implications of Derek's insults, but she could feel the cruelty behind them. Marcus immediately knelt down and pulled his daughter close, whispering gentle reassurances while fighting to control his own rising anger. The crowd of tourists had now completely focused on the unfolding confrontation. Many were filming with their own phones, though their expressions showed disgust at Derek's behavior rather than entertainment. The elderly veteran had moved closer, clearly prepared to intervene if the situation escalated further. "Please stop," Marcus said quietly, looking up at Derek while still comforting Emma. "You're scaring my daughter. Whatever your problem is with me, she doesn't deserve to be part of it." Derek laughed coldly at the plea. "Maybe you should have thought about that before bringing her to watch this ridiculous display. Or maybe before you decided to play soldier and collect disability benefits for probably stubbing your toe overseas." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. Derek's casual dismissal of military service and his cruel assumption about disability benefits revealed a level of ignorance and callousness that shocked even the most patient observers. Several tourists began voicing their disapproval, but Derek seemed energized by the reaction. Marcus stood slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. Emma clung to his leg, still sniffling from the cruel stranger's words. The contrast between the gentle father comforting his child and the aggressive businessman seeking attention was stark and obvious to everyone watching. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Marcus said, his voice carrying a quiet strength that made Derek's loud bluster seem even more pathetic by comparison. Derek stepped closer, sensing what he thought was vulnerability. "Oh, really? Then why don't you enlighten us? Tell us all about your heroic military career. I bet it's not nearly as impressive as you let people believe." The businessman's phone remained pointed at Marcus, recording every moment of what Derek believed would be his victim's humiliation. He had picked his target based on subtle signs of physical limitation and what he assumed was a mild temperament, expecting an easy victory that would make him look dominant and clever. Marcus looked down at Emma, then at the faces of the tourists around them. He saw disgust at Derek's behavior, sympathy for his situation, and curiosity about how he would respond. The guards remained at their posts, professional and unmoved, but Marcus could sense the tension even in their stillness. "My military service isn't entertainment for your video," Marcus replied calmly. "And it's not something I need to prove to someone who clearly has no understanding of what service means." Derek's face reddened at what he perceived as evasion. "There we go, just like I thought. You can't back up your tough guy act because there's nothing to back up. Probably never left whatever safe base they stationed you at." The businessman turned to address the crowd directly, his voice growing louder and more theatrical. "This is what I'm talking about, people. Fake veterans who want all the respect without any of the risk. They parade around in public expecting thanks and sympathy for their imaginary sacrifices." A woman in the crowd called out, "Stop being so cruel. You don't know this man's story." Derek whirled toward her voice. "I know enough. Look at him. Can't even defend himself when challenged. Real veterans don't hide behind their children when someone asks them direct questions." Marcus felt something deep inside him shift. Derek's attacks on his character were one thing, but suggesting he was using Emma as a shield crossed a line that even his patient nature couldn't tolerate. His daughter looked up at him with tear-filled eyes, waiting to see how her father would handle this terrible situation. The moment stretched taut with tension. The bustling sounds of London traffic seemed to fade into the background as the confrontation reached its peak. Derek held his phone higher, clearly expecting Marcus to either back down completely or lose his temper in a way that would make for dramatic footage. Instead, Marcus made a decision that would expose Derek's ignorance in the most devastating way possible. With calm dignity that stood in sharp contrast to Derek's aggressive behavior, Marcus reached down and began rolling up his left pant leg. "You want to know about my military service?" Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard. "You want to know what I sacrificed for my country?" Derek's triumphant expression began to falter as he realized something significant was about to happen. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that the confrontation was about to take an unexpected turn that would reveal truths Derek was completely unprepared to face. The fabric of Marcus's jeans rolled up slowly, revealing first his sock, then his ankle, and finally the unmistakable metallic gleam of his prosthetic leg. The advanced titanium and carbon fiber construction caught the morning sunlight, its sophisticated engineering a stark testament to the reality of modern warfare and its consequences. A collective gasp rose from the crowd of tourists. Derek's phone wavered in his hand as the full impact of what he was seeing hit him. His face went pale as he realized the magnitude of his mistake, but it was far too late to take back his cruel words and assumptions. Marcus continued rolling up his pant leg with calm precision, revealing more of the prosthetic limb that had replaced the leg he lost to an improvised explosive device on a dusty road outside Kandahar. The device was clearly sophisticated and expensive, the kind that allowed veterans to maintain active lifestyles despite their injuries. "This is what I left in Afghanistan," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying across the silent courtyard. "Along with 3 of my fellow soldiers who didn't make it home at all. We were escorting a convoy of supplies to a remote outpost when our vehicle hit an IED. Emma looked up at her father with new understanding, seeing the metal leg that he had always kept hidden beneath long pants. She had known her daddy was hurt in the war, but seeing the physical evidence made the reality more concrete for her young mind. Derek stood frozen, his recording phone now feeling like a weight in his trembling hand. The cruel accusations he had made about fake disabilities and easy military service echoed in his mind like accusations against his own character. The tourists around him stared with a mixture of horror at his behavior and profound respect for Marcus's sacrifice. Marcus straightened up, letting his pant leg fall back into place. "I spent 14 months in hospitals and rehabilitation, learning to walk again, learning to be a father again, learning to live with the nightmares and the phantom pain that reminds me every day of what happened to my friends who didn't make it home." The elderly veteran in the crowd removed his cap and held it over his heart, tears streaming down his weathered face. Other tourists followed suit, creating a spontaneous moment of respect that contrasted sharply with Derek's earlier mockery. "The guards you've been insulting," Marcus continued, his gaze steady on Derek's shocked face, "are members of the same military family I belong to. They've sworn the same oath to protect their country and its people. Some of them have served in combat zones. All of them deserve respect for their commitment to service." Derek's mouth opened and closed wordlessly. His expensive clothes and confident demeanor now seemed like a costume compared to Marcus's quiet dignity. The businessman's social media video had captured his own humiliation in vivid detail, preserving his cruelty and ignorance for posterity. A woman in the crowd spoke up, her voice shaking with emotion. "You should be ashamed of yourself. How dare you speak to a war hero that way?" Others joined in, their voices rising in condemnation of Derek's behavior. "Disgusting," called out a middle-aged man. "This man sacrificed his leg for his country, and you attacked him in front of his child." Derek looked around desperately, realizing that every person in the crowd was now staring at him with disgust and contempt. His phone had recorded not his expected triumph over a supposed fraud, but his own exposure as a cruel bully who had targeted a genuine war hero. I didn't know," Derek stammered, but his words fell flat. His earlier confidence had evaporated completely, replaced by the dawning realization of how badly he had misjudged the situation. "You didn't want to know," Marcus replied calmly. "You saw what you thought was weakness and decided to attack it for your own entertainment. You made assumptions about my service and my sacrifices without knowing anything about me." Emma tugged on her father's jacket, and Marcus knelt down to her level. She whispered something in his ear, and he nodded with a gentle smile. Standing, "Back up," he addressed Derek one final time. "My daughter wants to know why you were so mean to the soldiers and to us. I told her that sometimes people who have never served don't understand what sacrifice means. But she thinks you should apologize to the guards for being disrespectful." The innocence of the child's request, delivered through her wounded father, struck the crowd like a physical blow. Here was a little girl, traumatized by Derek's cruelty, still thinking about the feelings of others and the importance of respect. Derek looked at the faces surrounding him, seeing judgment and disgust in every expression. His expensive lifestyle and business success meant nothing in this moment. He had revealed himself to be exactly the kind of person that decent people despised, a bully who picked on those he perceived as vulnerable. But the most devastating blow was yet to come. As Derek stood there in his humiliation, processing the full weight of what he had done, he failed to notice that his cruel performance had attracted the attention of someone whose response would ensure that his lesson in respect was far from over. The crowd's attention began to shift slightly, focusing on something behind Derek. A new presence had entered the courtyard, drawn by the commotion and the reports of disrespectful behavior toward both the guards and a visiting veteran. Derek remained oblivious to this development, still struggling to comprehend how completely his bullying had backfired. The crowd's murmurs grew more intense as a figure in military dress uniform approached the scene with purposeful strides. Colonel James Mitchell of the Grenadier Guards had been conducting an inspection of the palace security arrangements when reports reached him of a disturbance involving disrespectful behavior toward both the Queen's Guard and a visiting veteran. Colonel Mitchell was an imposing figure even without his authority. Standing 6 feet 4 inches tall with 30 years of distinguished military service behind him, he carried himself with the kind of presence that commanded immediate attention. His uniform was immaculate, his bearing perfect, and his expression suggested he was not pleased with what he had been told about the situation. Derek, still reeling from his public humiliation, didn't notice the approaching officer until the colonel's shadow fell across him. When Derek finally looked up, his face went even paler than before. The sight of a high-ranking military officer in full-dress uniform was enough to make anyone nervous, but for someone who had just spent the morning insulting soldiers and veterans, it was particularly terrifying. "I am Colonel Mitchell," the officer announced, his voice carrying the authority of decades of command. "I've been informed that there has been some disruption here involving disrespectful behavior toward my guards and harassment of a veteran visitor." The tourists stepped back respectfully, creating a clear space around Derek, Marcus, and the colonel. Many continued recording, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Emma moved closer to her father, awed by the impressive figure in the elaborate uniform. Colonel Mitchell's gaze swept over the scene, taking in Derek's expensive suit, Marcus's calm dignity, and the obvious distress that had affected the crowd. His experienced eyes missed nothing, and the reports he had received were clearly being confirmed by what he observed. "You are the gentleman who has been causing problems?" the colonel asked Derek directly, though his tone made it clear this was not really a question. Derek's throat worked soundlessly for several seconds before he managed to croak out, "I was just making some observations about the ceremony." "Observations," the colonel repeated flatly. "I've been told these observations included insulting my guards, questioning their courage and professionalism, and making cruel assumptions about this veteran's service record and disabilities." Each word from the colonel seemed to make Derek shrink smaller. The businessman who had been so bold and aggressive just minutes earlier now looked like a scolded child facing a stern headmaster. Colonel Mitchell turned to Marcus with a completely different demeanor. "Sir, I understand you served in Afghanistan?" "Yes, Colonel. 3rd Battalion, Parachute Regiment. I lost my leg to an IED near Kandahar 3 years ago." The colonel's expression softened with respect. "The Paras, outstanding unit. I'm deeply sorry for your sacrifice and for the disrespectful treatment you've received here today." He looked down at Emma. "And this must be your daughter?" Emma nodded shyly, still intimidated by the impressive uniform but sensing the colonel's kindness toward her and her father. "What's your name, young lady?" "Emma," she whispered. "Well, Emma, your father is a genuine hero. He served his country with honor and made tremendous sacrifices to keep people like you safe. You should be very proud of him." Emma's face lit up with a bright smile, the first genuine happiness she had shown since Derek's harassment began. "I am proud of him. He's the best daddy in the world." Colonel Mitchell smiled warmly at the child before turning back to Derek with an expression that could have frozen fire. "Now, as for you, your behavior today has been absolutely disgraceful. You have insulted the Queen's Guard, harassed a war veteran and his child, and shown complete ignorance about military service and sacrifice." Derek attempted to speak, but the colonel's raised hand silenced him immediately. "I understand you were recording your behavior for social media?" Colonel Mitchell continued. Excellent. That means there will be a permanent record of your cruelty and ignorance for everyone to see. The colonel's voice grew more stern. Let me educate you about the men you've been insulting. The Queen's Guard are active-duty soldiers, many of whom have served multiple combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. They are highly trained, disciplined professionals who have earned their positions through excellence and dedication. Derek's face was now bright red with embarrassment and fear. The tourists around him continued to stare with disgust, and he could hear whispered comments about his behavior from all directions. Furthermore, the colonel continued, your treatment of this veteran is particularly vile. This man sacrificed his leg in service to his country, endured months of painful rehabilitation, and continues to live with the physical and emotional consequences of his sacrifice. Your assumptions about his service and your mockery of his disability reveal a character that is frankly contemptible. The colonel paused to let his words sink in before delivering what everyone sensed would be his final judgment. You have two choices, Colonel Mitchell announced, his voice carrying across the silent courtyard. You can leave these premises immediately and never return, or you can remain here and explain to the Metropolitan Police why you thought it appropriate to harass a disabled veteran and his child in front of Buckingham Palace. Derek's expensive watch glinted as his hands shook slightly. He looked around desperately, but found no sympathy or support anywhere in the crowd. Every face reflected the same message. He had revealed himself to be exactly the kind of person that decent society rejected. The moment of his final humiliation had arrived, and Derek realized that his cruel entertainment had transformed him from predator to prey in front of an audience that would never forget his shameful behavior. Derek stood frozen under Colonel Mitchell's steely gaze, his expensive suit suddenly feeling like a costume that couldn't hide the smallness of his character. The weight of every cruel word he had spoken seemed to press down on him as he realized there was no escape from the consequences of his behavior. I choose to leave, Derek mumbled, his voice barely audible compared to the confident bluster he had displayed earlier. I thought you might, Colonel Mitchell replied coldly. But before you do, you owe apologies to several people. First to my guards whom you insulted with your ignorant comments about their service and professionalism. Derek looked toward the stoic guards, who remained perfectly still at their posts. His throat felt dry as he struggled to find words that could somehow undo the damage he had caused. I apologize to the guards, he managed to say, though his voice lacked any genuine remorse. It was clear he was simply trying to escape the situation as quickly as possible. Louder, Colonel Mitchell commanded. And with sincerity, these men deserve better than your mumbled attempt to avoid further embarrassment. Derek cleared his throat and raised his voice slightly. I apologize to the Queen's Guard for my disrespectful comments. I was wrong to question their service and dedication. The colonel nodded grimly. Now apologize to this veteran for your cruel assumptions about his military service and your mockery of his sacrifice. Derek turned toward Marcus, who stood with quiet dignity beside his daughter. The contrast between Derek's squirming discomfort and Marcus's calm composure was stark and obvious to everyone watching. I apologize for what I said about your military service, Derek said, still unable to meet Marcus's eyes directly. I was wrong to make assumptions about your sacrifices. Marcus nodded once, accepting the apology with more grace than Derek deserved. Apology accepted, he said simply. I hope you've learned something today about making judgments without understanding. And, finally, Colonel Mitchell continued, you owe an apology to this young lady, whom you frightened and upset with your aggressive behavior toward her father. Derek looked down at Emma, who pressed closer to Marcus's side. The sight of the child he had reduced to tears seemed to finally pierce through his self-absorption, and for the first time, his expression showed what might have been genuine regret. I'm sorry I scared you and was mean to your daddy, he said, to Emma, his voice softer than it had been all morning. Your father is a hero, and you should be proud of him. Emma looked up at Marcus, who nodded encouragingly. "Thank you for saying sorry," she replied with the simple honesty that only children possess. Colonel Mitchell stepped closer to Derek, lowering his voice so only the businessman could hear clearly. "Let me give you some advice that might serve you well if you're capable of learning from this experience. Real strength comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down. Real courage is shown by people like this veteran who risk everything for others, not by bullies who attack those they perceive as vulnerable." Derek nodded rapidly, eager to end the encounter and escape the condemning stares of the crowd. "Your behavior today will follow you," the colonel continued. "Your own video has captured your cruelty for posterity. I suggest you think carefully about the kind of person you want to be and whether your current path is taking you there." With that final warning, Colonel Mitchell stepped back and gestured toward the palace gates. "You may leave now, and remember, you are not welcome to return." Derek began walking quickly toward the exit, his expensive shoes clicking against the cobblestones with urgent desperation. The crowd parted before him, but not out of respect. Their faces showed continued disgust and disappointment at his behavior, and many continued recording his humiliating departure. As Derek disappeared through the palace gates, the atmosphere in the courtyard began to shift. The tourists who had witnessed the confrontation approached Marcus with expressions of admiration and support. "Thank you for your service," said the elderly veteran, shaking Marcus's hand firmly. "And I'm sorry you had to deal with that ignorant fool." Others echoed similar sentiments, with families taking photos with Marcus and Emma, treating them with the respect and honor they deserved. Emma's spirits lifted as she found herself surrounded by kind people who appreciated her father's sacrifices. Colonel Mitchell approached Marcus one final time. "Sir, I'd like to invite you and your daughter for a brief tour of parts of the palace that aren't normally open to the public. It's the least we can do after the disruption you experienced." Emma's eyes went wide with excitement, and Marcus smiled gratefully. "That would be wonderful, Colonel. Thank you." As they walked toward the palace entrance, Emma skipped alongside, the impressive officer, chattering excitedly about the guards and asking dozens of questions about military life. Marcus followed, reflecting on how a morning that had started with such promise, turned dark with cruelty, had ultimately ended with kindness and justice. Behind them, the Queen's Guard remained at their posts, professional and unwavering as always. The tourists resumed their respectful observation of the ceremony, and the normal, peaceful atmosphere of the historic location was restored. Derek's expensive car sat in traffic several blocks away, the businessman staring at his phone in horror, as he watched his own recorded cruelty being shared across social media platforms. The video that was supposed to showcase his wit and dominance instead revealed him as exactly the kind of person that decent society despised. The lesson in respect had been delivered with devastating effectiveness, and Derek would spend years trying to rebuild a reputation that he had destroyed in a single morning of breathtaking cruelty and ignorance. Meanwhile, Marcus and Emma continued their celebration, surrounded by people who understood the true meaning of honor, service, and sacrifice.